You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we continue trying to answer the question, why do modern horror movies love the 1980s so much? Here we go. Welcome to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. With me, as always, fellow co-host Pete Charbonneau. And Pete, in part one of our conversation, we wanted to answer the question that was on our mind. Why do modern horror movies love the 80s so much? Whether it's the setting, the tone, the style, we've seen quite a few modern horror movies that have taken a reference, draw heavily from the 1980s. We're talking movies like It Follows, certainly inspired by 1980s slasher and supernatural horror flicks. 2018's Mandy, that has a ton of neon lighting and heavy synths to spare. House of the Devil, that was literally set in the 1980s during the Satanic Panic era. The VHS franchise, the group of anthology films that are explicitly set in the 1980s, they kind of use found footage horror to recreate a lot of that home video, mom and pop video cassette culture of the era. So whether it's a longing for a simpler time, a time when there was no social media, there weren't no cell phones, as Stranger Things has taught us and reminded us, there were kids on bikes having adventures and stumbling onto dead bodies and demons from other worlds. And even if culture, fashion, music, all of these things kind of have a cycle, the 1980s is not gone. It's certainly not forgotten.
There's a general feeling about nostalgia these days, I think. I don't know. I think it's different, but I don't know. Because everybody nowadays has lived through the videotape revolution, the home theater revolution, okay? So a lot of these movies have been seen at home, been rented, been downloaded. But in my day, we didn't have that. That didn't exist. So it's a different, the nostalgia is very different. But I'm not much of a sage on modern movies. I really don't know.
And to continue our conversation for part one, Pete, so this one's a softball because obviously we've talked about this, the explosion of the slasher boom in the 80s that saw the genre defined with all the tropes, the final girls, the mass killer, the stalker POV shots, all the stuff we saw on Friday the 13th, Halloween, stuff that we still see in modern horror films as they kind of look back to that golden age. That one's too much of an easy one, so we're not going to go with the softball there. But I think there's probably two practical, technical ways where we saw that explosion of slasher films, the slasher boom in the 80s that we still see now and that, again, modern film seems to be fond of. And I think one is practical effects and special effects, because names like Stan Winston, Rick Baker, Bottin, Savini.
Come and take a peek at everything on the screen that makes you scream with the man who's created some of the scariest moments in horror history. Scream Greats Volume 1 presents Tom Savini, master of horror effects.
My old friend Jason has been sliced, diced. I mean, he's been killed 58 times. In Day of the Dead, I had 6 guys working for me. 3 months before we started shooting, we did elaborate zombie. We're making generic zombie appliances, small, medium, and large. In many ways, I still have not grown up, and that's luckily for me where the magic still exists and how I can put it into things, you know.
Shout It Out with Tom Savini, master of horror effects.
All those new possibilities in special effects with technology comes improvement. So I have to think that during that time period, maybe there was improved latex or better squibs or animatronics. I don't know, stuff that we saw in the movies seemed to look better every year because you had these geniuses, these wizards, these artists making these things that left a lasting impression on us that, yes, maybe the mileage varies on how special the effects were, but there is something nostalgic about that era where we think about now where if CGI can essentially do everything, there's something, again, tangible, analog about that era and the people that were able to make that magic.
Oh, for sure. And, you know, and kind of going back to what we originally started with people like Spielberg and Lucas that were influenced by the serials and Flash Gordon and things like that. Like now you've got these makeup masters who are influenced by someone like Jack Pierce, and that grew up loving the Universal monsters and wanted to bring into the world their own monsters with their own imaginations. And yeah, like you said, like people like Rick Baker, Stan Winston, Rob Bottin, like just took it to just a completely different level. I'm sure there was a lot of innovations. I think they may argue in terms of how much a difference with budget, but they had more money to work with, maybe not as much money as they would have liked, or maybe it's not as much time as they would have liked to pull some of these things off. But on the other hand, that tends to lead to invention and coming up with other ways to do things that, you know, when you're kind of put on the spot because you've got 3 weeks to come up with a creature effect where maybe if you could go away and sketch it out and work on some things, maybe you'd like a couple of months to do that, but you know, you don't have time to do that. So it's like, all right, so how do we make this work in 3 weeks? And then, you know, that's now firing a different skill set that you've got to bring to bear on it. And yeah, anything from like the KY jelly, the goop that kind of gave these creations that extra feel like, you know, this was something from outer space, or this is something that came from the sewer or something like that. It's like, it wasn't just, you know, a foam latex. You could tell that there was like there was something oozing from this. There was perspiration, something very tangible and that felt very real that maybe you didn't get from the earlier generation stuff that was just now new and exciting. And it's like, and by all accounts, a fairly small group of people that were creating a lot of this stuff. Like it's, you know, we're not talking about like a giant pool of talent here. These are just like some really dedicated, devoted, wildly creative minds that were pushing the envelope to bring us, you know, just a different level of chills and excitement when we went to the movies.
I do vividly remember going to the drive-in with my parents, you know, and I was a little kid in my pajamas in the back seat. And we went to see, there was a re-release of King Kong when Godzilla came out. They were like on a double bill at my local drive-in. And my dad was a science fiction and fantasy horror film buff, so he told me about all these films and I was excited to see him. And the double bill started out with Godzilla. And I kind of fell asleep partway through Godzilla, I think, because it was past my bedtime. So Godzilla was actually the one I remember seeing, and I thought it was King Kong. So, you know, it was like on a Saturday night, and my parents were sleeping in on Sunday morning, and I decided I was going to make a King Kong costume. I actually got out some cardboard and, you know, a paper bag, and, you know, I cut out some of those, you know, Godzilla fins for my back, and, you know, made this kind of paper bag mask. And, you know, when my parents finally got up, I went, you know, look what I made. I made King Kong, you know, and I was like, well, no, actually you made Godzilla. you didn't make it through King Kong.
And especially, I think, at a time when, if special effects prior to that, unless, again, you're making specifically a horror movie or sci-fi film, effects could be an afterthought. And now you're starting to get some of these really talented folks who are now a line item in a budget. There is now money being spent towards hero syrup and KY jelly and Methicil and all of these things, and making these contraptions that make stuff look good, which makes studios think, you know what, if we get the right people behind us and we give them some money, they can actually make things look amazing, which in turn puts audiences' butts in seats, which in turn puts money in our pockets. Yes, with every good practical effect that made it on the screen and made us go, whoa, that's amazing. And we had to talk about it all during lunch or recess. That allowed another special effects person that maybe had the budget, but to be fair to your point, also likely didn't have the budget to become inventive, to think of something and be able to do that.
Realism, everything, acting, locations, the monster, everything presented is real. Making a monster movie comes down to some simple basics that you have to face as a director. What are we going to end up with? A man in a suit, hiding in the shadows, jumping out with big teeth and a grotesque face? No, we shouldn't do that. Let's do something different. Let's take a subject that we're all familiar with, monsters from outer space, and take it as far as it's ever gone, and make the audience believe that this is happening. That's what we try to do.
So I think outside of practical effects, though, there's also something else that goes with it, which is synth. Because, yes, we see a lot of modern 80s movies that lean into the neon of it all, the fluorescent lighting of it all. Yes, good modern 80s inspired horror films don't just look like the 80s, they sound like the 80s. I think fair to say synth is part of that authenticity, or at least that attempt to parallel the authenticity of what the filmmaker believes is the 80s. It just has a different sound than more of the orchestral sound. And there's practical reasons regarding like home video, cheaper production, new sonic tools that are out there, people getting to experiment.
This is kind of my wheelhouse of growing up listening to a lot of this music, but it's weird too, because I don't always have the best ear for soundtracks and scores. Like the famous ones, yes, but I can find myself getting really immersed in a movie where I'm more focused on what's happening as opposed to like some of the aural, AURAL cues that come in. But that being said, yeah, it's funny because we were talking offline about this, and so I started to think about last night this premise in my head of like, oh, well, synth, especially in the 80s, kind of had this connotation of like, this is the future because it was still new. Synthesizers, I think, probably started in the 50s or 60s, but like when they started to become commercially viable for, your average person to maybe afford one, now you're talking like 70s and 80s. In my mind, I'm like, oh, I'm thinking of, the marriage between film and pop music, whether you're scoring a film or doing audio effects or you're trying to write a pop song. The age of the synthesizer kind of coming in and still being very analog in a lot of ways, like coming up, like you're learning how these things are working on parallel tracks.
John Carpenter was just a few years out of USC Film School when he composed it to add melodic malevolence to his classic Halloween.
It's that sort of repetition, and the audience is kind of waiting for something to change.
It's putting you on your nerves. Like, what is going on? Let's get this thing changing. Come on now. Stop this repeating over and over and over.
It's driving me crazy.
Yeah, that's it.
Someone like John Carpenter, who is like, I'm going to score Halloween because I can do it cheap and fast this way, as opposed to if you've got the money and you've got the budget. I've got this relationship with John Williams, so I'll get the London Symphony Orchestra and John Williams to do this. And so that's where my hypothesis originally kind of got skewed, because I was like, oh, futuristic. There must be all these sci-fi movies from the 80s that probably had like this great synth soundtrack, and my brain first went to Tron for some reason, maybe because the new Tron movie is out, which does have, thanks to Trent Reznor and Nine Inch Nails, does have a very, it basically is what we're talking about. Like it's got that very 80s icy synthwave sound to it. So I'm like, oh, well, the first Tron probably has that too. It's like, oh, no, that was scored by the London Philharmonic Orchestra. So it's like, as we were talking about offline, those sci-fi films were kind of taking stuff because the creators were taking their cues from stuff that they grew up on the 50s and 60s. So like to have like the horns and the triumphant upbeat stuff is like, yes, that's the sci-fi element, but that icy synth that you get in Halloween 3 with Alan Howarth, and who you and I, along with some of the other Stranger Friends, recently got to see live with a performance in Carolina for Splatterflix. That's kind of like what you kind of go back to when you're thinking of like that icy synth, but it's also very minimalist, because again, you don't have the where you do now, where you can either put it all on computer, or you can buy several keyboards and several synthesizers and kind of layer sound. It was all very basic. And it reminded me of with pop music, bands like Gary Newman, who had that song Cars, which was very popular. But even before that, when he was doing stuff with Two Boy Army, like has a very similar vibe. Early Human League, early OMD, like if you're not as into that music as I am, you might be thinking, oh, Don't You Want Me Baby, and If You Leave. But like their earlier iterations, when they were first starting out in the 70s, was really experimental stuff using synthesizers, and very, very different than their pop stuff. If you listen to that, it's like a lot more in line with those early 80s synth scores for some of those weirder, darker movies. And, want to say filmmakers, I know a lot of those artists were influenced by the German band Kraftwerk that was doing some of the earliest stuff with synthesizers from a pop music standpoint. And so then I started to think about, so what were some of those early 80s movies that had that sound that that if you watch Stranger Things, like that's like, oh yeah, this is so 80s. It's like, okay, so like stuff, anything from like Legend and The Keep, Thief, Risky Business, Firestarter, Blade Runner for sure. Greek artist Vangelis did Blade Runner, also did Chariots of Fire. But you've got like these electronic artists. Tangerine Dream, I feel like, were the go-to artist in the 80s. Like if you wanted, they weren't necessarily prog, but they were electronic based. I mean, they, again, like a bunch of the movies I just mentioned, Legend, The Keep, Thief, Risky Business, they did the soundtrack to all that and more.
What impressed me was the quality of the soundtrack from Suspiria was its absolute simplicity, but its effectiveness. In other words, had it been more complicated, had it been the John Williams Mickey Mouse kind of score that you hear all the time today, that movie wouldn't have been half as scary.
Something like Goblin doing Suspiria, like that early synthesizer sound, Videodrome with Howard Shore has a mix of synth and strings. Phantasm has got a great early synth score. The Lost Boys, when you're getting a little more into the 80s, everyone thinks the Lost Boys and you think of Tim Campello with the saxophone, or the Echo and the Bunnymen cover, or In Excess and Jimmy Barnes. And the pop music part of that is one thing, but like if you go to the actual music cues from that movie, it's very synth-like. And then if you move on into later into the 80s, it became a little more commercialized and sounded a little more poppy with stuff like Harold Faltermeyer doing Beverly Hills Cop and Fletch, which is a lot more poppy. That's like the next generation using the synths and, getting away from that icy synthwave stuff that is today a tremendously popular and populated subgenre of music. Like if you call up retrowave bands and darkwave bands, like there's so many of them that go out of their way to capture, I wouldn't even say like, yes, it's an homage in a lot of ways to the 80s, but they're almost like creating soundtracks to films that were never made. And so you've got stuff like Time Cop, 1983, Gunship, Kavinsky, like a movie like Drive is like, I think, the perfect example of what we're talking about here from like a modern film's perspective. Cliff Martinez, who did Drive and Solaris and a bunch of other films, like this is the stuff that we're talking about. It Follows, The Guest. These are the movies, like when you listen to those soundtracks, they evoke the 80s in ways that I think a lot of times in the 80s wasn't even there. Like, you have to do a little digging to kind of get that sound, but it's all kind of mashed in there. And it's all, to your point, like 20 years on and then double that 40 years on, it comes back and it still resonates with so many people. And it still evokes such a feeling of like, you hear even from one of these modern bands, you hear an album or you hear a song and you're just like, oh, this must be from some 80s movie that I've never seen before. And I think that's by design. That's kind of like the space that they're living in. But this is all informed by the stuff like Tangerine Dream, Vangelis, John Carpenter, and Alan Howarth that were doing this stuff a lot of times just because, like Carpenter himself said, I can do it cheaper and I can do it faster. And, we don't have the money to bring in an orchestra. We're going to do this. This is experimental. It'd be kind of fun. I have this Moog keyboard. We can make some funky noises with this and let's give it a go.
The synthesizer was because you could sound big. I composed because I'm cheap and I'm fast. And we just didn't have any money for a composer and hiring a soundstage with musicians. And what kind of music should go with Assault?
One of my favorite bands of all time, New Order, made that transition. Like they started out as Joy Division, very much drums, bass, guitar. And then Ian Curtis kills himself. They carry on. They bring in Gillian Gilbert. They start experimenting because they've got this technology and they're experimenting with drum machines and loops and sequencers. And all of a sudden they're making dance music, which is just almost a 180 from what they had been. That is echoed in a lot of the soundtracks from that time, especially the early 80s. when you've got this technology similar to the makeup effects. You're seeing all of this innovation, and you're seeing the technology kind of take a real step forward. And so you go from the early 80s or even the late 70s with a lot of stuff like Suspiria and some of these films where minimal score, but it evokes just something so 80s in it. And a lot of it, I think, was probably just by design and by the technological restraints of the time. But now you're getting that replicated, and it could be replicated a lot easier.
Well, in the beginning when I was doing all the Star Treks and stuff like that in the early 80s, we had analog synthesizers. And the sound effects editors would come back and say, well, we need something more organic. We need something that really sounds real, not electronic, unless in the case it's an electronic effect. So at that, originally we were using tape recorders and sound, and you would manipulate tape. And there was a lot of experimentation just with tape recorders at the time. Well, now we're into digital sampling. All this stuff is on computers. So the manipulation of real sound and the processing of real sound has really become electronic. It's really merged together in one platform. So it's a great opportunity now with all this digital stuff to make these sort of electronic layer cakes where it's really the sound of this and this and this and this, but you now as an audience just perceive it as the sound of just one thing you're watching.
I saw a clip of Alan Howarth talking about how, because he's been doing this for a long time, everything from soundtracks to coming up with the sound of the transporter in Star Trek The Motion Picture to Carol Ann's voice in Poltergeist, coming up with what that would sound like. He was saying in this interview how you can put all this stuff on a computer now. You can put 18 different Moog synthesizers onto your computer and get the sounds that you need. He's like, what you lose in that is kind of fiddling with the dials to come up with, okay, we've got all these presets on this machine here, but if I just tweak this a little bit, maybe I get a different sound out of it. No, isn't that cool? That could work. Oh, hey, doing this work with John for, Escape from New York. I got a pretty cool sound here, but now this is making something completely different. Like, I got to get this in here. And so maybe you lose a little bit of that because you're not experimenting as much because the stuff is already kind of built in. And he was talking about how, because he's been doing it for so long, he doesn't mind that trade-off. But kind of, again, to the broader point of what we were talking about, this is neither good nor bad, but back in the 80s, maybe there's a little more experimentation going on just with the actual physical components of the synthesizer. I don't mean to say that and dismiss the exploration that goes on in using this equipment, because I think there's a shit ton of that going on as well. But I think just the actual physical, let's twist some knobs and see what sound comes out of it. And, oh shit, that sounds great. Now, oh, what do we just do? How do we replicate that? How do we record that? And how do we then integrate that into this score that we're working on? So
there was a great opportunity working on Poltergeist for Steven Spielberg. And I remember sitting in a room with Spielberg and Michael Kahn and Frank Marshall, and we came to the sound of the little girl's voice. So now you have a story point where the voice is in another dimension. Everybody's looking up to the ceiling going, oh, there, we hear this sound, but what is that sound? So I remember Spielberg telling me he wanted the sound to be Earth to Venus. And I remember sitting there like, oh my God, what does he mean? I don't have any idea. But of course you say, I got one of those, that's great. And I walk out in the hall and I just start to sweat like, wow, this is not going to work out. But the funny part is, I went through, after a lot of experimentation, I was riding in the car one day on my way back to Paramount Studios at the time, and this old Led Zeppelin tune comes on called Whole Lotta Love. And if you remember in Whole Lotta Love, there's this little break where Robert Plant sings all by himself. And there was this little pre-echo, like, you need my love. And it turned out it was a headphone that was on the floor and had another take that was out of sync. But they loved it and they kept it in there. And I heard that and I went, that's it, Earth to Venus, that's what he's talking about. So that it took that and modulated that in, and we, at the time, took tape recorders and I played the sound of the girl's voice into reverberation backwards, and then flipped the tape around so we had reverse reverb and then reverb playing up there, and it became this what we call the Carol Ann effect. And it was great. And when you do dialogue, it's right up front. You hear all that stuff.
It's fascinating stuff. It's an interesting kind of like DNA strand of a ribbon that kind of keeps winding and twisting around itself a little bit and keeps coming back. These things come together, they separate for 10 or 20 years, and then it seems to kind of loop back around, and you've got the artists that are doing it today, and you've got a ton of movies that are coming out just evoking a time period in a way that, it seems like a lot of creatives are not tired of going back to that time in music and film.
I think it makes sense to stay in the Alan Howarth lane for a little bit, because that idea of experimentation was one of the stories he actually told us when we were watching him at the Carolina Theater. And I think part of like the inaugural celebration for the 2025 Splatterfix was an Alan Howarth concert. The stories that he told on stage in between his performances, Carpenter just shows up to his house, a bunch of 2 kids, like, let's just play with these toys. And let's see what kind of music we can make, because we have these new toys and the loops and the digitalness of it all. Again, hearing from him, seems like he and Carpenter were kindred spirits in the, like, this stuff makes things more accessible, but it still leads us to the same place, trying to create that atmosphere, that eeriness that we want to convey, the sort of that aesthetic that is just so synonymous with synth. There is something about that, like that creeping tension that I always really just kind of put together. Like you said icy, like, yeah, there's like a cold silence that you get through synth. And maybe that is part of the artificialness of it all, kind of like you were starting to say, like the false futurism of it, like where it sounds futuristic because it doesn't sound warm and orchestral. It sounds very different. It doesn't sound like you have 100-piece orchestra that's playing. But there's something about that equals 80s horror, that when you now get modern horror movies that are trying to kind of harken back to that era, it's kind of a quick shortcut where you can have a synthwave soundtrack. Like in a movie like The Guest or It Follows, it takes all the horror tropes and then you get the synthwave soundtrack underneath it. You get the horror soundscape that we think of when we think of 80s films. Hearing Alan Howarth talk about that, how a lot of this stuff was as much intentional as it was experimental, that because he helped shape the sound of that era, shape some of the sounds that we grew up with in the same ways that, no, that's what an 80s inspired horror movie sounds like, or at least that's what I think it should sound like.
How cool was it when he busted out the guitar, was playing the guitar riff for the theme to Big Trouble in Little China? I mean, it's like, it's so cool because it sounded perfect. It sounded like pitch perfect. And yeah, to your point, there's a lot of his music specifically. And I got to call out again, like the soundtrack to Halloween 3, regardless of what you think of that movie. And I know that it's now achieved like cult status, but for the longest time was not a fan favorite. Just some great tracks on it. It's interesting when you listen, or if you listen to the soundtracks to Halloween 2 and Halloween 3, there's that very definite progression of the synthness of it all, because the first one very much, I don't know if Carpenter may have recorded it on a synthesizer or a keyboard, but it very much has the piano, like that. The main theme has very much the piano feel to it. But then Howarth comes in for Halloween 2 and gives it that little extra something. And I think his background in jazz helps a little bit, because he was kind of what he did in concert, where he was kind of playing over a lot of the themes that were like loaded up on the laptop, because it was just him, the keyboard, and a guitar. And so he was kind of just jamming over top of some of that stuff. But then you go Halloween 2 to Halloween 3, to me is almost like the ultimate like early 80s synth. You can definitely hear that progression in just those 3 soundtracks alone.
What this whole really episode is about, like that idea that Carpenter sound, the synth wave of the 80s, just makes it all sound like the 80s. I think all of these factors, right, whether you think they're bullshit or not listening to this I think it all just goes down to like one really big kind of like question, that idea of like originality versus homage, where you get modern horror films that copy the 80s look or the 80s sound, but are they actually reinventing it? Is there something new that they're trying to say? Or are they just using the 80s as a crutch, a Cliff Notes version to actually, in some ways, like avoid authenticity, adopting and adapting? They're just taking the aesthetic of it, but there's actually nothing there of substance. And I think that's where it still goes back to like the idea of enhancing the story. If it all makes sense, it's in service of the story. It's to be meaningful. It shouldn't just be a VHS filter that you're throwing onto whatever you're doing.
Right. Yeah, I think that's exactly right, because you and I have seen certainly enough of those where it's like, well, if we have, the VHS, static and the tracking, that's enough, because people can be like, oh, cool. It's like an old video cassette. It's like, well, like, yeah, but that's very superficial. Like, there's got to be a little more thought behind it as a designer, whether you're designing, doing graphic design or visual, whatever the case may be, like to just put the articulation on there. But what else is going on? Like, how is that serving your story? How is that serving where this movie is taking place in? To kind of talk again about how this episode has kind of gone around with like this aesthetic and this genre of like the push and pull of like what was coming out in the 80s to what was informed by the 80s and is being played as an homage to the 80s, or is maybe being a little bit more of an homage to the 80s. It's like, oh no, we're really influenced and we want to almost like create something that could have fit back then. We just weren't alive back then, or we were too young back then, but we want this to almost be a part of that decade and that time period, in something that can only be extremely on the nose. While I was doing some of my research and listening to the various soundtracks going back to the 80s and some of the recent films that we talked about, noticed that in 2025, that would be this year, Alan Howarth, who we were just talking about, collaborated with Goblin and a synthwave outfit called Retro Future to come out with a new single called Late Night Call, which is available on Spotify and I assume any other place that you listen to your streaming music. So encapsulating everything that we just talked about here, you've got a modern synthwave outfit. You've got Goblin, who we talked about did the soundtrack for Suspiria and a lot of Dario Argento films, very much in the vein of what we talked about. And then Alan, who we saw and who we've just been talking about for the past 15 minutes or so, coming together to once again mine a little bit more of that 80s vibe in 2025.
It always goes back to, right, like there's the originality of it all. There's a difference between homaging, pastiche, pulling on our like nostalgia strings, and actually making something that, yes, may be inspired or takes place in the 80s, but it has something to say. And I think that's where a lot of these kind of separate themselves. Black Phone, The Guest, The Void, all movies that they either take place in the 80s, or I'd be surprised if they didn't, because they certainly had a lot of that vibe. Stranger Things as a TV show rather than a film, Kids on Bikes, Small Town Horror, Stephen King, Goonies, the music, the fashion, Stranger Things dripping in 1980s. It Follows, that came out in 2014. We kind of mentioned that a few times. It's not set in the 80s, I believe, and there is specifically one scene that we could probably all cut to with what may be a cell phone, but we're not 100% sure. That kind of lets you know that maybe this is an alternate universe, but it's got 80s oozing all over it too. Final Girls, that came out in 2015. Characters that are trapped inside a 1986 slasher film. Very meta commentary, but also, again, because it leans into it in all the right ways, I think that commentary has fun with the nostalgia. Another movie that has fun with the nostalgia is Totally Killer. Came out in 2023. Time travel, so a little bit of Back to the Future with a little bit of Halloween. Protagonist goes back to 1987. So you get a little bit of the self-awareness of a modern day teenager, go back, completely aware of all the slasher tropes, the neon stylings, the fashion, the cocaine use, the synth soundtrack that's supposed to go on, and still has to kind of survive. Again, when they're smart and they're well done, you get something like Totally Killer. Censor, explicitly set in 1985 in UK, during Moral Panic, during the Video Nasties era. House of the Devil from 2009, set into early night in the 80s during the whole satanic panic era of it all. There's two that take place in the summer, neither of which are very good for the characters in the movies. It's 2018 Summer of 84, just like Hell of a Summer, which came out in 2003. It was directed by, going back to Stranger Things, Finn Wolfhard. He was one of the directors of it. Summer camp slasher, has all the tropes in there, very self-aware. Yes, I get it. This is taking place in the 1980s camp, and I get what's supposed to happen, but you guys are aware of that, and you're having fun with it. I think probably a good one to maybe end up with the WNUF Halloween special.
Don't check your dial, folks. You didn't tune into Transylvania's public access station. No, sir. Tonight is Halloween.
Halloween is Satan's night, the night of the devil.
Reporter Frank Stewart has a special Halloween treat in store for viewers tonight. He'll be leading a group of paranormal experts to the infamous Weber House.
Do you know what happened here in the Weber House?
When people got killed, their son went haywire.
Frank Stewart and his team of experts will conduct the first ever live on TV seance.
Evil works in mysterious ways, Frank. It's unpredictable.
Are there any spirits in the house?
It's scary.
That's far out.
There's a bad aura.
Something strange going on in this house. Animal mutilation, paranormal disturbances, devil worship. Wait, whoa, hold on. This is not staged. Hello? Is this the work of the devil? Folks, we are going where no camera crew has gone before. Father, perform the exorcism. This is not some Halloween prank. The grisly evidence of the supernatural is real. We'll be right back.
You're watching the WNUF Halloween special.
Came out in 2013, directed by Chris LaMartina. I'd like to say friend of the show. He's been on quite a few times with his lovely wife, Melissa, who also recently directed For Sale by Exorcist. The WNUF Halloween special, it's designed to look like a local news Halloween special. It has all the aesthetics of VHS, plays on that idea of finding a tape at a thrift store, watching it, and you're not fully sure if it's real or not. And it's done with a lot of love, a lot of authenticity, because again, the best examples of this are done with a lot of love and a lot of authenticity.
Absolutely. Yeah. And some amazing local TV style commercials that you and I both remarked about. I know for sure, like I didn't know the commercials because they were made for the film, but I knew those commercials growing up on Long Island the way that I did. I'm like, I saw commercials for these exact type places. And that's what I was loving about it. I'm like, this is just so up my alley.
And I think we can all agree, Pete, Frank Stewart for president.
Oh, Frank makes the whole thing worthwhile. Since I took the music portion of this, if you are liking this aesthetic, and you're not familiar with that retro wave, synth wave, outrun, it's got many titles. I'm not a big person in titles, but it's that modern 80s vibe. A couple of that I've mentioned, but Time Cop 1983, Gunship, Kavinsky, Electric Youth, Desire, Chromatics, Bunny X has a great album, and a band that I actually got to see in person, Boy Harsher, who on top of sounding very dark 80s minimalist synth with some banger songs, they also made a soundtrack for a short film that they produced called The Runner in 2022. So if you're interested in this soundscape at all, give those a try, and I think you won't be disappointed. It kind of runs the gamut from more of the dark wave stuff to stuff that's probably a little more on the lighter 80s synth side. You get to kind of pick and choose whatever you're in the mood for.
Whether it's a love for the music, whether it's a love for mom and pop video stores, maybe it's a love for simpler times without social media, without cell phones, kids on bikes, that whole thing. Modern filmmakers, they just keep showing us that the 80s aren't dead. And that keeps being reflected in some of the modern horror movies that we're seeing and will likely continue to see, especially as technology advances. So when filmmakers are trying to tell a story where they really do not need video doorbells or drones or cell towers around, so much easier to just have the plot take place somewhere in the 1980s. For some people, it feels old. For some people like us, it's just our childhood. And for some movie audiences, it might just be a quick cliff notes. Oh, this takes place in the 80s. Okay, I think I know what I'm in for. So fair to say, 80s aren't dead. 80s is a zombie. They'll just keep coming back.
Forever and ever and ever.